我宣布
The 9,856 meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, Under-Secretary General, United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. And Ms. Natalia German, Executive Director, Counterterrorism Committee, Executive Directorate. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Voronkov.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, I am honored to brief the Security Council on the 20th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security and the United Nations efforts in support of member states in countering this threat. I am pleased to be joined by Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, Ms. Natalia German, to present this report, which was prepared jointly by our offices. I would also like to thank Mr. Colin Smith, Coordinator of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, for their contribution in preparation of the report. Mr. President, Excellencies, the terrorism landscape is evolving and demands collective multilateral action as terrorist attacks threaten life, well-being, and the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals. Despite steady counter-terrorism efforts by member states, international and regional partners, Daesh continues to demonstrate resilience and adapt its modus operandi. The volatile situation in the Syrian Arab Republic is of great concern, especially as there is a risk that stockpiles of advanced weapons could fall into the hands of terrorists. The Syrian Badi region continues to serve as a center for Daesh external operational planning and a critical region for their activities. This instability also affects the camps, detention, and other facilities in the northeast of the country. An estimated 42,500 individuals, some with alleged links to Daesh, remained held. This includes 17,700 Iraqi and 16,200 Syrian nationals, as well as 8,600 nationals from other countries. Regrettably, the overall pace of repatriations declined significantly in the reporting period. Only 5 member states reportedly repatriated more than 760 individuals from Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic. The government of Iraq repatriated approximately 400 Iraqi children from the northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic to a rehabilitation center. I would like to commend Iraq's leadership in facilitating the return of its citizens from northeast Syria. I reiterate the Secretary General's call for member states to to facilitate the safe, voluntary, and dignified repatriation of their nationals still stranded in those camps and facilities. ISIL Khorasan has continued to pose a significant threat in Afghanistan, the region, and beyond. In addition to attacks in Afghanistan, ISIL Khorasan supporters plotted attacks in Europe and were actively seeking to recruit individuals from Central Asian states. There were also reports of small numbers of foreign terrorist fighters continuing to travel to Afghanistan. I would like to recall the Secretary General's appeal to all member states to unite to prevent Afghanistan from again becoming a hotbed of terrorist activities. In sub-Saharan Africa, Daesh and its affiliates continued to increase their operations and expand territorial control. The situation is deeply concerning in West Africa and the Sahel, where Daesh affiliates and other terrorist groups intensified attacks, including against schools in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Both the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara and the Islamic State's West Africa province continue to operate and recruit fighters across borders. In East Africa, Daesh in Somalia successfully recruited foreign terrorist fighters, and the Al-Qarar office remains a key financial and coordination hub for Daesh in the region. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the allied democratic forces remained resilient despite the military operations conducted by Congolese and Ugandan forces and perpetrated horrific attacks resulting in over 300 civilian fatalities. Mr. President, Excellencies, the resilience of terrorist groups underscores the need for sustained international collaboration. Member states must prioritize comprehensive, long-term responses that address the conditions conducive to terrorism, while strengthening the rule of law and upholding international human and humanitarian rights. The United Nations continues to adapt and tailor its capacity-building support to the evolving of the threat posed by Daesh and its affiliates. I would like to highlight 4 priority areas of focus. First, as sub-Saharan Africa has become the epicenter of global terrorism, we have prioritized capacity-building support to the continent. Last year, my office increased its delivery of technical assistance by 16%. For instance, our Fusion Cell program delivered specialized training to 124 analysts from 21 African member states. Our Vulnerable Targets program provided tailored support to 5 new African beneficiaries, including Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, Mauritania, and Senegal, to enhance the security of critical infrastructures and soft targets. Second, in the light of the situation in northeast Syria, the United Nations continue to advise and support member states in their efforts to prosecute, rehabilitate, and reintegrate individuals associated with terrorist groups. In Iraq, my office provided advice, training, and equipment to assist with the registration and screening of adults seeking repatriation from the Al-Hol camp in close coordination with other UN entities. And in Central Asia, UNSC, the United Nations Regional Center for Preventive Diplomacy for Central Asia, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe supported the organization of the second meeting of the Regional Expert Council on Rehabilitation and Reintegration of Returnees. In the context of returnees, it's important to recall that many people who are now in camps in Syria and Iraq actually fled from Daesh violence. It's therefore paramount that we continue to amplify victims' voices to ensure sustained support for victims of terrorism. To pursue these goals, the Office of Counterterrorism co-organized with the government of Spain the International Conference on Victims of Terrorism last October, convening participants from 66 countries. Third, we need to further strengthen border security to counter terrorism, to counter movements of terrorists. Last November, my office partnered with the governments of the state of Kuwait and Tajikistan in the framework of the Dushanbe process to organize a high-level conference on strengthening international cooperation and building agile border security mechanism. The Kuwait Declaration on Border Security and Management emphasized the importance of multilateral cooperation and innovative border security measures. Meanwhile, our flagship all-of-UN Countering Terrorist Travel Program continued to expand with 63 beneficiary member states who are increasingly relying on the Go Travel software to collect and process passenger data to detect and prevent terrorist movements. Fourth, we continue to support member states in harnessing the opportunities offered by new technologies. In November, we launched the City Tech Plus initiative with Interpol and the European Union to provide tailored support to address the misuse of new technologies for terrorist purposes. In addition, my office delivered operational trainings to over 100 officials in Southeast Asia and West Africa to operate unmanned aerial systems for counterterrorism and border security purposes. Mr. President, Excellencies, terrorism remains a significant and evolving threat to global peace and security, one that no state can confront in isolation. Sustained multilateral cooperation remains essential to countering terrorism effectively. In the Pact for the Future adopted last September, member states renewed their commitments to a future free from terrorism and highlighted whole-of-government and whole-of-society approaches to counter-terrorism. The United Nations, through its Global Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact, remains committed to supporting member states in this regard. By working together, we can address this evolving threat and build a more secure future. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Vorontsov for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Gelman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I'm honored to address the Security Council on the 20th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security, as well as to highlight the efforts of the United Nations to support member states in addressing these challenges. And I wish to thank Under-Secretary General for Counterterrorism and Head of the United Nations Office for Counterterrorism, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, as well as Mr. Colin Smith, Coordinator of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, as well as all of our United Nations partners for their close collaboration on this report. Mr. President, the challenges posed by Daesh remain complex, with humanitarian, security, and governance concerns persisting across regions affected by its activities. The humanitarian and security crisis in the northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic remains dire, with more than 40,000 individuals confined in camps and detention facilities under conditions marked by overcrowding, inadequate shelter, and limited access to clean water and sanitation. Beyond the Middle East, Daesh remains agile, taking advantage of ongoing conflicts and regions experience growing instability. As we heard from the Deputy Secretary General in the Security Council last month, after devastating so many parts of the world for more than a decade, Daesh and other terrorist groups now pose the most significant threat to peace, security, and sustainable development across the African continent. Armed terrorist groups such as Islamic State West Africa Province exploit fragile conditions to recruit and use children, commit abductions, and attack schools and hospitals. In the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, Daesh centralized operations continue to proliferate as regional cooperation declines. As underlined by recent reports of CTED and the monitoring team, the role of regional financial hubs used by Daesh and its affiliates has also expanded. Addressing these threats requires an approach centered on prevention, grounded in respect for human rights, and with regional cooperation as the linchpin. The United Nations has continued its efforts to support member states in addressing the threat posed by Daesh. On behalf of the Counter-Terrorism Committee, in the last year, CTED conducted visits to Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Malawi, Mauritania, the United Republic of Tanzania, as well as other affected regions, to assess the implementation of Security Council resolutions on counter-terrorism. CTED has just finalized an assessment visit to Somalia. These assessments highlighted promising practices, such as the adoption of whole-of-government approaches to counter-terrorism and efforts to address conditions fueling violent extremism conducive to terrorism. At the same time, the committee's assessments also revealed persistent challenges, including gaps in border security, ongoing deficiencies in national counter-financing of terrorism responses, and the need for stronger regional collaboration to counter the transnational nature of Daesh activities. Officials in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire expressed the need for the United Nations to support improved regional cooperation, which is essential to counteract further expansion of the terrorist threat southward. Other United Nations efforts have focused on strengthening humanitarian responses and enhancing institutional frameworks. The United Nations has facilitated the civil documentation and reintegration of displaced individuals in the Middle East, even as the pace of repatriation has significantly declined. Equally important, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration programs remain a cornerstone of these efforts. Tailored initiatives have strengthened rehabilitation in prisons and focused on community-based socio-economic reintegration services, particularly for vulnerable adolescents. And in parallel, facilitating accountability for terrorism offenses and promoting respect to human rights in counter-terrorism remains priorities. The conclusion of UNITAD's mandate marked a milestone, leaving behind an impressive judicial support legacy, as well as noteworthy archive for possible future accountability processes. Furthermore, considerable strides have been made in assisting member states with countering the financing of terrorism. Mr. President, as mandated by the Daily Declaration, the Counter-Terrorism Committee just last month adopted the non-binding guiding principles on preventing, detecting, and disrupting the use of new and emerging financial technologies for terrorist purposes, also known as the Algeria Guiding Principles. The guiding principles have been prepared with the support of CTED and highlight the importance of a comprehensive and risk-based approach and provide practical guidance to member states. To raise awareness of member states and implementing partners on the evolution of terrorism financing threats, in November last year, CTED published a report highlighting the changes in how foreign terrorist fighters have financed their activities over the past 10 years. CITAD is also engaged in joint projects with the Financial Action Task Force in this regard and has supported relevant capacity building initiatives of other global compact entities, including a UNODC initiative in Mozambique, where the first successful prosecution of a terrorism financing case was recently achieved. Mr. President, these collective efforts underscore the importance of a united and adaptive response to the evolving threat posed by Daesh. The group's ability to exploit instability highlights the need for sustained international cooperation. CITAD, working alongside member states and other United Nations partners and entities, remains committed to ensuring that our actions are countering the emerging challenges. I thank you.
我感谢
I thank Ms. German for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, President. And since this is my first time sitting with you in this council, I'd just like to congratulate you on your presidency and again acknowledge and thank Algeria for your leadership last month. Thank you, Undersecretary Vladimir Voronkov and Executive Director Natalie German, for your joint preparation of the 20th ISIL report and for your briefings. Countering ISIS and other terrorist groups around the world is a top priority for the Trump administration. President Trump has already taken decisive action in conjunction with the Somali government by directing precision airstrikes against ISIS in Somalia on February 1st. President Trump's message is clear. The United States always stands ready to find and eliminate terrorists who threaten the United States and our allies. ISIS has expanded the frequency and lethality of its attacks in the Sahel, making this region the global epicenter for fatalities from terrorist attacks. As such, ISIS Somalia, ISIS Sahel, and ISIS West Africa collectively pose a significant threat to stability and prosperity in Africa. As the Secretary General's report highlights, ISIS affiliates in Central Asia, most notably ISIS Khorasan, also pose a significant global threat. We remain concerned about ISIS-K's capabilities to plot and conduct attacks, as well as sustained recruitment campaigns, particularly in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are also watching closely the situation in Syria. The United States wants stability and security in the region, and we want a Syria that lives in peace with its neighbors, respects human rights, and prohibits terrorists from using its country as a safe haven. The United States urges member states to repatriate expeditiously and prosecute as appropriate their foreign terrorist fighter nationals currently in Northeast Syrian detention facilities. These individuals must not be allowed to replenish ISIS's ranks. The United States is committed to preventing Syria from being used as a base for ISIS, Iranian-backed terrorism, or other terrorist groups that threaten the region. The complete and verifiable destruction of Syria's chemical weapons program is vital to regional security and stability, and ensuring these weapons are not used for terrorism. Accountability for terrorist attacks and other terrorist activity is key to the fight against terrorism and to deterring such acts from taking place in the future. In that vein, we urge the members of this council to take action and agree to list more ISIL and al-Qaeda affiliates in the 1267 Sanctions Committee, so that they will be subject to a worldwide assets freeze, travel ban, and arms embargo. Further, we encourage member states to play an active and timely role in updating and implementing UN 1267 sanctions to counter ISIS and al-Qaeda. Money is the lifeblood of terrorists. We must bolster our collective efforts to stem the flow of funds to terrorists and terror groups. Finally, as the Secretary General correctly notes, member states' efforts to counter terrorism must expand beyond the security-centered approaches and include comprehensive efforts to prevent and deter emerging terrorist threats. The measures member states take to counter this grave threat to international peace and security must be in line with the rule of law, respect human rights, and not be used as a pretext to silence political dissent. I thank you.
我感谢美国。
I thank the representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, President. I thank USG Vladimir Voronkov and Executive Director Natalia German for their briefs. President, terrorism today remains a grave and urgent threat to international peace and security. Only last month, we gathered in this very room to discuss the increasingly devastating impact of terrorism on the African continent. One important takeaway from that discussion is the fact that terrorism is evolving. With this evolution, we are seeing shifts in the means and motivations for terrorist activities, growing interlinkages between criminal and terrorist groups, and increased use of information and communications technologies, including gaming and social media platforms, to bolster resources and recruitment and to aid radicalization. Modern technology is also being misused for coordinating attacks. The Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team has reported extensively on the increased risk of online radicalization and recruitment, targeting youth and minors, and the growing use of cryptocurrencies by ISIL, Daesh. The Secretary General's 20th report on the threats posed by ISIL has also sounded the alarm about the potential use of artificial intelligence by terrorist groups, given the widespread accessibility of advanced technology and experiments with artificial intelligence. Also alarming is the fact that member states have reported a decrease in the average age of those being radicalized to terrorism. President, terrorism knows no boundaries. It is not confined to any specific group, country, or region. Addressing the security challenges alone will not result in sustainable solutions. Combating terrorism requires a comprehensive and holistic approach. In this context, Guyana commends the efforts of the international community and regional and sub-regional organizations to look beyond strict security concerns, to strengthen cooperation in development-related causes and solutions. The interlinkages between poverty, inequality, and marginalization, and terrorism and violent extremism are undeniable. To address the root causes, therefore, we must continue to prioritize socio-economic initiatives that empower communities, enhance educational opportunities, and create purposeful jobs, especially for our young people. Poverty and the consequent vulnerability of our young people in the absence of opportunities for a better life create fertile grounds for recruitment by terrorists. We also see an increasingly important role for the media and civil society, including academics and faith-based groups, in combating both terrorism and the violent extremism that can fuel it. Guyana acknowledges and commends the efforts of the United Nations in the continued support being extended to member states, including in the implementation of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy and relevant Security Council resolutions. Through our combined efforts, we have seen marked improvements in criminalization of terrorist offenses, intelligence sharing, border security, cross-regional and international cooperation, prevention policies and interventions, and improved counterterrorism strategies, among others. Notwithstanding these achievements, our goal of eradicating this scourge cannot be achieved without making real progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We must ensure that the Pact of the Future turbocharges SDG implementation as was intended. In this way, we can scale up preventive measures through addressing the root causes of terrorism, including poverty and marginalization. Additionally, our efforts must extend to supporting the victims of terrorism. We must provide them with the necessary assistance and ensure that their voices are heard. The perpetrators must be held accountable for their actions, and justice must be served. President, in closing, let us reaffirm our commitment to combating terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. The security and well-being of our people is at stake. Together, we can build a safer, more secure world for future generations. I thank you.
Guyana.
I thank the representative of Guyana. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank His Excellency the USG, Mr. Voronkov, and the Executive Director, Ms. Gurman, for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, on 21st of January, Algeria, as President of the Council, convened a high-level meeting on countering terrorism in Africa to sound the alarm in relation to the dire situation resulting from the expansion of terrorism in our continent. This meeting was a turning point in our collective approach in dealing with this threat. The presidential statement adopted by the Council demonstrates that the statement acknowledged the AU counter-terrorism institutional structure and the appointment of the AU champion for the prevention and countering of terrorism. In addition, it called on the Secretary General to provide annual updates on the joint efforts by the African Union and the UN. This comes as a recognition by the international community of the urgent need to address the situation and the importance of the responses led by Africa. They also highlight the outcomes of the meeting as demonstrated in the Secretary General report we are discussing today. The report draws a clear picture on the very alarming and worrying trends of terrorism, in particular in Africa. The report reflects what we notice on the ground. Addressing terrorism in Africa, in particular in the Sahel, takes place against armed groups, very well equipped, that are adopting advanced military strategies. Equally alarming, in particular, are the increasingly complex financing methods used by these terrorist groups, which include the conventional means like organized crimes, narcotic trafficking, illegal migration, trafficking in persons, kidnap for ransom, and new technologies and financial innovations.
الجزائر.
This highlights the importance of Algeria principles adopted by the Committee on Countering Terrorism in addressing these challenges. Against this backdrop, I would like to highlight the key points. First, coordination between member states, regional organizations, and UN entities on counterterrorism should be promoted. The evolving nature of threats, including those related to emerging technologies and evolving means of finance, require international cooperation. Second, addressing the root causes remains essential. The report of the Secretary General clarifies how the terrorist groups are using the lack of development, instability, and marginalization. Therefore, our response should combine security arrangements and development initiatives while focusing on creating opportunities for all in society. Third, the increased use of advanced technology by terrorist groups require coordinated international response to prevent the use of these technologies for terrorist purposes, while ensuring the respect for law. Based on the experience of Algeria in addressing and fighting terrorism, the success of our efforts require strong institutions, strong strategies, and comprehensive response, as well as unity and determination. In conclusion, Algeria reiterates its commitment to implementing the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy and relevant Security Council resolutions. Algeria will remain ready to share its experience to promote comprehensive approaches that combine security arrangements and prevention strategies. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also thank USG Voronkov and Executive Director German for their briefings. Colleagues, we meet today to discuss a threat that remains as urgent as ever. ISIL or Daesh continue ability to adapt, exploit instability, and spread its influence. Our briefers have been clear. Despite decades of international efforts, ISIL has not disappeared. Allow me to focus on three key areas. First, we must not underestimate ISIL's ability to exploit instability across the world. In Syria, the fall of the Assad regime marked the end of more than half a century of a brutal and repressive dictatorship. As this new day dawns, we must collectively work to prevent a security vacuum for ISIL and other terrorist groups to exploit. The possible release of detained terrorists and the potential resurgence of ISIL networks pose serious risks to Syria, the Middle East, and globally. Denmark urges all actors to react responsibly and avoid any actions that could further destabilize the situation. In this regard, maintaining security around the camps and detention facilities, as well as providing much-needed humanitarian aid, addressing the root causes of ISIL recruitment, and curbing radicalization are important tools to prevent the re-emergence of ISIL. Beyond Syria, ISIL Khorasan remains a major threat in Afghanistan and the broader region. From attacks to propaganda and recruitment, the group actively seeks to expand its influence in Central Asia, attempting to destabilize the region. Its external operations, including plots in Europe, highlight the need for strengthened regional cooperation, intelligence sharing, and counterterrorism coordination. Disrupting ISIL-K's financial networks, propaganda, and operational capabilities must remain a priority. Across Africa, ISIL is expanding its footprint, fueling instability and security, and committing grave human rights abuses. Across the Sahel, and increasingly in the neighboring states in coastal West Africa, the Lake Chad Basin, and Central Africa, the group thrives on instability and weak governance. In the Horn of Africa, the increasing presence of foreign ISIL fighters is a growing concern as they exploit global travel routes. Meanwhile, emerging links between terrorist groups and piracy are raising new concerns for maritime security, highlighting the urgency of strengthening regional cooperation, including by strengthening border controls and improving intelligence sharing. Second, Mr. President, it is easy to be discouraged when facing a threat that keeps mutating despite years of efforts to prevent and counter it. We have invested significant resources, attention, and coordination in fighting ISIL. The fact that the threat persists does not mean that we have failed. The Secretary General's report highlights the important progress and lessons learned. At the same time, we must stay vigilant and flexible. ISIL has adapted, it has retained financial reserves, it has built a strong propaganda network utilizing new technologies. Simply doing more of the same would not be enough. We must constantly reassess and refine our strategies. If we're slow and rigid, we will always be one step behind. Third, Mr. President, Denmark's stand is clear. An effective response against terrorism must go beyond security measures. The rule of law, inclusive and meaningful participation, and human rights are not obstacles to counterterrorism, they are its very foundation. When we compromise these principles, we weaken both our credibility and the long-term effectiveness of our efforts. A comprehensive approach is critical. one that pairs effective security measures with prevention while addressing the root causes of terrorism within a framework of human rights and strong institutions rooted in the rule of law. Counter on radicalization requires not only military and law enforcement efforts, but also investment in education, economic opportunity, and community resilience. Upholding fundamental rights and reinforcing institutions that promote justice and accountability are essential to fostering long-term stability. Meaningful cooperation with local actors, youth, civil society, and the integration of the Women, Peace and Security agenda are all vital for sustainable success. Mr. President, to conclude, as ISIL remains an evolving threat, our response must be resolute yet adaptable. We must have the courage to reassess our approach when circumstances shift, rather than simply reinforcing existing efforts. Denmark will continue to work closely with international partners to ensure a counterterrorism strategy that is agile, results-driven, and firmly rooted in our shared values. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
I would like to thank USG Mr. Voronkov and seated Executive Director Mrs. German for the detailed briefings and insightful remarks. Mr. President, allow me to make the following 5 key points. First, we continue to be very much concerned, even more due to reasons of geographical proximity, about radicalization in the broader Middle East. In this regard, religious and ethnic communities in the Middle East should be given particular attention as they are among the main targets of terrorism. In particular, the situation in Syria remains of grave concern. The instability following the fall of the Syrian government on 8 December presents a security vacuum that could be exploited by Daesh and other terrorist groups. In this regard, urgent efforts are required to ensure that stockpiles of advanced weapons, including unmanned aerial systems, do not fall into the hands of terrorists. In parallel, humanitarian assistance must be provided, not only because of the dire humanitarian conditions, particularly in detention facilities and camps in the northeast, but also as a sine qua non for an effective counterterrorism effort. The adoption of Resolution 2761 provides us with a complete institutional framework. Despite the seismic changes in Syria, Greece reiterates its support for Security Council Resolution 2254 of 2015. In this spirit, we reaffirm the need for a political roadmap which will include constitutional reform, free and fair elections, and inclusive governance. This is the only way towards the eradication not only of Daesh, but of terrorism in general. Second, we should not disregard terrorist acts at sea and the serious implications of maritime security. Disruption of supply chains, serious limitation to freedom of navigation, as well as a destabilization of entire maritime regions are just a few of the consequences of terrorism at sea, which highlight our responsibility to combat this serious threat. Third, the protection of cultural heritage must remain a priority. Daesh and its affiliates have systematically targeted historical and religious sites in an attempt not only to erase cultural identities and fuel ideological narratives, but also to fund their activities through the trafficking of looted cultural artifacts. We stress the importance of implementing measures to safeguard cultural property in accordance with relevant Security Council resolution, including Resolution 2347 of 2017, which condemns the destruction of heritage as a tactic of war and a means of financing terrorism. Fourth, Women, Peace and Security agenda must be central to our counterterrorism response. In this regard, we welcome the clarification in Resolution 2734 of 2024 that sexual and gender-based violence constitutes a form of terrorism. Fifth and last, children remain among the most vulnerable victims of terrorism, facing the risk of recruitment, radicalization, and exploitation. In accordance with Security Council Resolution 2427 of 2018, children affected by armed conflict must be treated primarily as victims, with dedicated efforts to provide rehabilitation, education, and integration programs. Mr. President, in concluding, let me reiterate Greece's full support of UN counterterrorism efforts and its commitment to uphold the principles enshrined in the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. The reality we face necessitates a comprehensive and coordinated international response that integrates security measures with initiatives that address the root causes of terrorism, while always protecting and respecting human rights and international humanitarian law provisions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece. I now give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd like to commend you and the Chinese delegation on your skillful leadership of the Security Council during this month's presidency and for convening this important briefing today. I would also like to express my gratitude to Under Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov and Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of CTED, Ms. Natalia German, for their thoughtful remarks. We take note of the 20th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security. We also take note of the 35th report of the monitoring team for the 1267 ISIL, Daesh and Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee. Mr. President, Pakistan condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. For more than 4 decades, we have remained at the forefront of global counterterrorism efforts and been a principal target of terrorist attacks, financed by our adversaries in the region, and we have paid a heavy price in innocent lives lost, 80,000 casualties, and enormous damage to our economy. Mr. President, the global terrorism landscape has evolved significantly since the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1373. Terrorist attacks have increased globally, especially across the Middle East, Africa, and in and from Afghanistan. While Al-Qaeda core was decimated in Afghanistan, largely, I may mention, due to Pakistan's efforts, several of Al-Qaeda's subsidiaries have emerged elsewhere, including in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Daesh was suppressed in Syria and Iraq, but the franchises have also emerged in Afghanistan and in the Sahel. As noted in the Secretary General's report, the threat posed by Daesh and their affiliates is undiminished, and they remain resilient and adaptable to counterterrorism pressure. Mr. President, the international community must address the terrorist threat together through a comprehensive, coordinated, and principled strategy based upon the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, the GCTS, adopted by the General Assembly. I would like to make the following suggestions in this regard. 1. We need a more effective response to the current and escalating threats of terrorism. We discussed the response to the complex challenges of terrorism in Africa a week ago. Mention has been made in this debate on the situation in Syria. We must sincerely address the terrorist threats from Afghanistan. After successfully decimating Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups within our borders, I like to repeat that, within our borders, Pakistan continues to confront terrorist threats such as the TTP, Daesh, and the Majid Brigade, operating from safe havens across our borders. We are concerned that while mention is made of Daesh, the threat that is posed to Pakistan by the TTP and by the Majid Brigade have not been mentioned by our colleagues around the table. Mr. President, there are over 24 terrorist groups operating inside Afghanistan. Also, the main hub for ISIL-K's recruitment and facilitation, as confirmed by the monitoring team's report. And I would like to repeat that. Afghanistan is the main hub of recruitment of ISIL-Daesh, and we reject any imputation that there is any such recruitment in Pakistan. We are fighting Daesh, we are fighting TTP, we are fighting the Majid Brigade, and we will continue to do so with determination. This threat of Daesh, TTP, Majid Brigade, is a threat not only to Afghanistan, not only to Pakistan, but to the entire region and beyond. Those responsible for this situation must take these assessments into account, and the scale of the threat posed by these terrorist groups and their affiliates, which are well documented in the reports of the Secretary General and the monitoring team reports, must be responded to. The Council must act on these assessments. Pakistan has adopted a comprehensive national counterterrorism strategy to eliminate the threat of terrorism from across the borders. 2, we must address the root causes of terrorism that include poverty, injustice, and prolonged unresolved conflicts, foreign occupation, and the denial of the right to self-determination to peoples under colonial and foreign domination and alien rule, such as the occupied territories of Palestine and Jammu and Kashmir. Without addressing the root causes, we can hope for little success if our focus remains restricted to the consequences of such policies. 3, the necessary changes are needed in the UN's counterterrorism architecture and sanctions regimes to ensure that they are adequately equipped to respond to the current challenges and represent a fair, just, and comprehensive mechanism. Pakistan also supports the Office of the Ombudsperson and advocates strengthening its operational capability and effectiveness. 4, we are concerned about the use of new technologies, including ICTs, by terrorists to organize online and collaborate with transnational criminal networks to recruit and finance their activities. We must address the new cyber tools of terrorism, including the dark web and cryptocurrencies, which are being utilized increasingly for radicalization campaigns, incitement to violence, terror financing, propaganda, and disinformation through the social media. 5, terrorism continues to mutate into various new forms that are not being effectively addressed. To comprehensively defeat terrorism, we must address the new and emerging forms of terrorism, including violent acts by white supremacists, far-right extremists, violent nationalist, fascist, xenophobic, Islamophobic, and anti-Muslim groups, and similar ideologies in various parts of the world. 6, it is our collective responsibility to ensure that counterterrorism efforts around the world are not misused to violate human rights and international humanitarian law. There must be accountability for the violation of fundamental human rights, especially the right to self-determination and in situations of foreign occupation. 7, the international community has failed to address state terrorism, including the use of state power to suppress legitimate struggles for self-determination or to continue foreign occupation, which are amongst its worst manifestations, and the state sponsorship of terrorism in other countries is also unaddressed. 8, despite protestations to the contrary, counterterrorism policies have so far singled out only one religion, Islam, for affiliation with terrorism and extremism. Such concepts that stigmatize Muslims have fanned the flames of Islamophobia and fueled further radicalization. Mr. President, these gaps in the UN's counterterrorism efforts need to be addressed, and it is for this reason that Pakistan believes that the UN General Assembly should establish a subsidiary body to promote the universal consideration and balanced implementation of all 4 pillars of the global counterterrorism strategy, with the vital support of the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism as its executing arm. We will explore this proposal in consultation with all interested member states and Mr. Vladimir Voronkov. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan. I now give the floor to Somalia.
Mr. President, let me begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the Undersecretary General, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, and Ms. Natalia German, the Executive Director of CDET, for their comprehensive briefings. Their insights provide invaluable guidance for our collective deliberations on this critical matter. Our shared commitment to global peace and security faces a continuous challenge as terrorist threats evolve and adapt to our changing world. Recent assessments demonstrate that terrorist organizations remain resilient despite our collective efforts. They have shown remarkable adaptability, transforming their organizational structure and leveraging new technology to pursue their objectives. This adaptability demands an equally dynamic and coordinated international response. The international community's achievements in combating terrorism are significant, yet we must acknowledge that our work is far from complete. The threat has become more complex, with terrorist groups exploiting regional instabilities, technological advances, and social grievances to further their aims. We have observed patterns of expansion across the regions, with groups establishing networks that transcend national borders. One area shared international concern is the increasing presence of the transnational actors associated with Daesh in our region. This trend requires our sustained attention and coordinated response. In this context, Somalia's response offers a promising example of effective countermeasures where the government has successfully conducted military operations with our international partners to neutralize foreign ISIL affiliates and implement joint security initiatives. These developments demonstrate both the challenges we face and the potential for success when we work together. The collaborative efforts approach offers an instructive example of how international cooperation can yield tangible results in our shared counterterrorism efforts. Our direct experience with these challenges have taught us valuable lessons. We have learned that countering terrorism requires more than just a tactical response. It demands a multi-phased approach that addresses both the immediate security threats and their underlying causes. The role of the prevention cannot be overstated. Therefore, we must address the root causes such as poverty and lack of education and unemployment that provide a fertile ground for the spread of extremism ideologies. Sustainable development remains our most powerful weapons in confronting terrorism. Technology presents both challenge and opportunities in our counterterrorism efforts. While terrorist groups increasingly exploit digital platforms and emerging technologies, this same advance can enhance our capability to prevent and counter terrorism activities. We must ensure that our response remains technically sophisticated while respecting human rights and the fundamental freedoms. The protection of civilians, particularly the vulnerable populations, must remain at the forefront of our counterterrorism efforts. Our strategies should prioritize civilian protection while ensuring that counterterrorism measures do not inadvertently create additional grievances that terrorist groups might exploit. Equally important is our commitment to strengthening international legal frameworks and ensuring their effective implementation. The various Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism provide a robust foundation, but their success depends on consistent and coordinated implementation by member states. Mr. President, to conclude, terrorism is a global challenge that affects all humanity, regardless of borders and beliefs and background. It requires sustained commitment, enhanced cooperation, and unwavering resolve. Success in our counterterrorism efforts depends on maintaining the delicate balance between security measures and respect for international law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. It's important to reaffirm our collective determination to combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, while upholding the principles and the values that define our international community. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia. I give the floor now to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG Voronkov and the seated Executive Director Natalia German for their comprehensive and informative briefings. The Republic of Korea remains deeply concerned that terrorism continues to undermine international peace and security. The Secretary General's report once again shows that Daesh persists and adapts across the world despite concerted international counterterrorism efforts. In Africa, terrorism has not only become increasingly widespread, but more lethal amid state fragility and complex regional dynamics. In West Africa, terrorism is encroaching from Central Sahel, which has already become an epicenter of terrorism, into the coastal states, severely affecting civilians, particularly children's education and humanitarian assistance. And East Africa is becoming a renewed region of Daesh focus for recruitment and financing, marked by advancement in weapons and technology. In Syria, Daesh still keeps trying to take advantage of regional instability and political upheaval. Daesh is reportedly exploiting administrative gaps in central Syria, using it as its center for planning its external operation and expanding its strategic reach and capacity. Moreover, detention facilities for Daesh in northeast Syria remain increasingly fragile. Long-standing humanitarian concerns, reports of internal recruitment, and the continued failure to repatriate detainees further heighten the risk of radicalization within these facilities. In Afghanistan, the ISIL-K's threat remains deeply intertwined with the country's fragile security landscape. The group continues to exploit ethnic and sectarian divisions, increasing recruitment among marginalized communities. Meanwhile, the expansion of jihadi madrasas creates an environment conducive to radicalization. While acknowledging the Taliban's counterterrorism efforts against ISIL-K, concerns remain over its selective response to terrorism. The broader dynamics among terrorist groups, including TTP and Al-Qaeda, add further complexity, requiring close monitoring and a more effective international response. Together, these global threats underscore the urgency of our coordinated actions to address the multifaceted challenges posed by terrorism. Please allow me to make 3 points in this regard. First, the rapid evolution of new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, presents both opportunities and challenges for counter-terrorism efforts. While terrorist groups are increasingly exploiting AI for propaganda and recruitment, AI also offers powerful tools to enhance our collective response to terrorism. By leveraging AI-driven analytics, we can improve threat detection, disrupt terrorist narratives, and bolster information integrity. In this regard, the Republic of Korea is pleased to announce its new AI and Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism PCVE project, designed in collaboration with the UNOCT. This project seeks to map out how terrorists exploit AI in their narratives and build the capacity of member states to counter these tactics by incorporating AI solutions. We welcome engagement from member states in this important endeavor. Second, evolving terrorism financing that leverages cyber technologies and digital platforms requires a new and coordinated response. As noted during the June high-level open debate during our Council presidency last year, malicious cyber activities are employed for terrorism financing, underscoring the need for continued vigilance. As such, we reiterate the importance of the Council deepening its understanding of evolving threats in cyberspace. We also welcome the CTC's recent adoption of non-binding guiding principles on countering terrorism financing, which offers timely guidance for enhancing national regulatory measures. As a member of the Financial Action Task Force, the Republic of Korea will continue its contributions toward developing robust standards on anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing. Third, preventing and countering violent extremism must be embedded in action plans for sustaining peace across the peace continuum. From the perspective of the humanitarian development peace nexus, initiatives addressing the root causes of radicalization play a pivotal role in containing the proliferation of terrorism and breaking the vicious cycle of conflict recurrence, especially during post-conflict peace-building processes. As the incoming informal coordinator between the Peace-Building Commission and the Security Council, the Republic of Korea will make efforts to explore avenues for enhanced collaboration between these two bodies. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of ROK. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, let me thank Under-Secretary General Voronkov and Executive Director Gurman for their very helpful briefings today. The United Kingdom remains fully focused on tackling the continued threat from Daesh and its affiliates. While steady progress has been made by the international community to suppress Daesh, we cannot become complacent. Daesh continues to exploit regional instability, drive division, and seek new ways to finance its operations through emerging technology. And this remains a global threat which we need to address collectively. In the Middle East, after decades of atrocities committed by the Assad regime, the United Kingdom stands with the people of Syria and their desire to build a more stable, free, and prosperous future. We welcome continued efforts, including by the global coalition to suppress Daesh and reduce the risks they pose as Syria embarks on this historic political transition. Iraq also remains a critical partner. The reduction in Daesh's influence and impact in Iraq is a credit to the Iraqi determination and sustained military efforts alongside coalition partners. The UK remains committed to achieving justice for survivors of Daesh crimes. We will continue working with the government of Iraq as they build on UNITAD's legacy and deliver accountability through their National Centre for International Judicial Cooperation. In Asia, ISKP continue to pose a threat despite work to combat them, including by Pakistan and other countries in the region. The UK continues to coordinate action against the group through the ISKP diplomatic grouping, targeting their propaganda and seeking to restrict their access to financial resources. In Africa, Daesh continues to spread across large parts of the continent, threatening regional stability and inspiring individuals to conduct attacks. The African Union plays a central role in coordinating the international response. The UK welcomes, for example, the renewed mandate of the Multinational Joint Task Force and the recent deployment of the AU Support and Stabilisation Mission to Somalia. Finally, we cannot fight terrorism with force alone. A whole-of-society approach with the meaningful participation of women, is needed to address the long-term drivers of terrorism. The protection of human rights and rule of law should be at the heart of all our efforts. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the UK. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, благодарим Владимира Ивановича Воронкова. Благодарим Владимира Ивановича Воронкова. Is there any interpretation?
There is interpretation.
Good. Господин
Mr. President, we thank Vladimir Ivanovich Voronkov as well as Madam German for their reports on the activities of the UN structures to counter ISIL, which have been entrusted to them. We highly value their efforts, and we will continue to provide them with comprehensive assistance and support. The latest specialized report of the Secretary General observes the fact that the threat from ISIL not only remains present but continues to grow. Last month in the Council, there was an open debate at the Council on counterterrorism in Africa. Practically all participants expressed concern about the activity of fighters. This reaffirms the relevance and the global scope of the threats. We firmly believe that the victory in counterterrorism can only be secured if we pool our efforts. In word, all agree with this premise. However, in deed, the pooling of efforts is becoming a formidable challenge. The problem lies in an unwillingness and unreadiness of certain states to abandon their policies of double standards. They use terrorists for the attainment of geopolitical goals, including the ouster of inconvenient governments, as well as the creation and the maintenance of simmering hotbeds of regional instability. A host of Western states do not view terrorism as an absolute evil, and they do not embrace a policy of zero tolerance vis-a-vis terrorism. For them, this is a tool for the advancement of neo-colonialist policy on sovereign states and to ensure their own domination. For this reason, without pangs of conscience, they support, they finance, and they arm terrorists. For this is very convenient by their own hands to cultivate the terrorist hydra in order, under the pretext of countering this, to carry out military aggressions, armed aggressions against foreign governments, and to engage in long-term occupation of their territory. African states who have found themselves on the front lines of counterterrorism efforts now speak frankly about the role of Western countries in the emergence of this problem. This includes the deliberate subversive activity and the years-long alleged counterterrorism operations, which when scrutinized turn out to be mere imitations in order to justify the pursuit of foreign military presence, which have something that the populations have long been unhappy with there. In this connection, we have drawn attention to the appalling and entirely unsubstantiated conclusion which is contained in the Secretary General's report, which is under consideration today. Allegedly, one of the reasons for the expansion in the eastward expansion of the activity of the ISIL affiliate in the Greater Sahara is the counterterrorism operations of states in neighboring regions between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Nigeria. How is it possible, in principle, to blame states for efforts to counter terrorism and attempts to protect their own population from terrorist fighters? These similar conclusions cast doubt on the competency of Secretariat staff, the Secretariat staff who drafted the report. Instead of such conjectures, they would be well advised to study the facts related to assistance to terrorists in the Sahel provided by certain Western states in Kiev, who have effectively provided cover for the activity of terrorists and have prevented their liquidation. Ukraine has been providing drones and weapons to terrorists. Their authorities have directly acknowledged that they have been provided assistance to Al-Qaeda affiliates who carried out attacks on government forces in Mali. Ukraine previously had been used as a staging ground for foreign terrorist fighters, and now it has morphed into a logistics hub from where weapons, Western weapons, provided to the Kiev regime are disseminated throughout the entire world. These weapons fall into the hands of both criminals as well as terrorists. Ukrainian authorities are flaunting the carrying out of terrorist attacks as well as their links with international terrorist networks. Mr. President, terrorism has its root causes. They include armed conflicts, poverty, the weakness of government institutions, the lack of control over natural resources. We cannot overlook the fact that many of these problems are often a part of the grim colonialist legacy. However, there is a trigger which is often left unmentioned. That is NATO's invasion into Libya and the invasion into Iraq, which spawned ISIL. We believe it is important also to discuss the fact that the cultivation of fighters and the establishment of extremist ideology is often carried out by non-regional forces. They deftly capitalize on socioeconomic issues. They engage in distorted interpretations of cultural and religious pillars, traditions, and values. They exploit ideas of fictitious superiority or, on the contrary, historical grievances. In this respect, the terrorist international, including Al-Qaeda and ISIL, as well as radical common with radical nationalists in Ukraine. The latter, with the support of Western sponsors, have transformed into blatant terrorists, distinguishing themselves, such as the Azov battalion has done, and other national neo-Nazi units of the Kiev regime have done, with systemic crimes and against peaceful populations, terrorist attacks targeting the Russian Federation as well as targeting other countries. Against this backdrop, we are not at all surprised that the recent disclosures related to the activities of the U.S. aid agency. We have long spoken about the fact that it has been financing radical elements throughout the world. Just before, this was attributed to Russian propaganda, and ultimately, it all came out to be truth. Mr. President, the problem of weapons falling into the hands of terrorists is something which was not duly paid attention to in the Secretary General's report. And yet repeatedly during operations to eliminate ISIL, there were vast troves, there was a great deal of weapons produced by the West found in storage sites of the militants, as well as weapons manufactured in East European factories. Even Western media outlets have had sometimes publications crop up on the topic of weapons deliveries to the Middle East region. And we cannot overlook the situation in Afghanistan. The growing activity of ISIL Khorasan is no coincidence. NATO troops who hastily left Afghanistan, abandoned vast quantities of weapons and equipment, and this then fell into the hands of ISIL and affiliates. President, we stress the significance of and importance of measures for the return of foreign terrorist fighters from armed conflict zones, specifically from Syria and Iraq. As it is seen in the Secretary General's report, the existence of such camps as Al-Hol and Rosh in northeast Syria, with tens of thousands of people, including women and children, is fraught with violence and human rights violations. These camps are hotbeds of radicalization, and they are used by terrorists to recruit new fighters. A number of states have been referring to political and legal issues, and they continue to refuse to repatriate their own citizens. And this is the real root cause for human rights violations, which are mentioned in the report. We call upon all states to step up efforts to ensure the return of their own citizens, including both the fighters themselves as well as their family members. And at the same time, the paramount priority following repatriation is holding such citizens accountable for the crimes that were perpetrated. The Russian Federation welcomes and is committed to the task of the return of our citizens. We have already returned more than 500 people, including women and children, from Syria and Iraq. We have been prioritizing their rehabilitation and reintegration. Mr. President, turning back to the matter of double standards in counterterrorism, I wish to stress that this approach undermines international peace and security. We demand that Western countries demonstrate transparency, that they renounce selective approaches when it comes to counterterrorism. Nearly a quarter century has elapsed since the events on 11 September. At that point, the international community expeditiously closed ranks and managed to produce a comprehensive counterterrorism architecture. It is important not to bury that foundation, which was so painstakingly forged through concerted efforts. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to thank the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, and the Assistant Secretary General and the Executive Director of the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, Ms. Natalia German, for their valuable remarks. I'd also like to thank you, Mr. President, for addressing this important topic on the agenda of your presidency. Panama expresses its deep concern at the latent threat posed by the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, Daesh, to international peace and security, as was highlighted by the Secretary General in his 20th report. This document reflects a harsh reality. Terrorism has not disappeared. It has transformed, infiltrating into digital spheres, exploiting conflicts, violating human rights, and taking advantage of scarce opportunities to recruit and to finance its cause. All of this serves as a wake-up call on several fronts. Firstly, it's worth paying attention to the persistence and adaptability of Daesh and its affiliates, as well as that of Al-Qaeda. The persistence or the continued survival of these international and national efforts to eradicate their presence, and it continues to pose a significant threat to international and regional security. There is a clear threat that unsecured stockpiles, including sensitive chemical weapons, could be used by terrorist acts. Hence the urgent need to enhance international cooperation to stem these groups' ability to mobilize and spread their propaganda. Furthermore, it's worth considering strengthening the sanctions regime as a mechanism for joint action to avoid these terrorist groups consolidating, focusing in particular on action against the leaders of such groups. While Daesh's presence has significantly shrunk, particularly in the Middle East, persistent political and social instability, both in this region and in Africa and Asia, continue to be a threat that enables the recruitment and radicalization of young people from various countries. This, in turn, dials up the challenge that they pose to the international community. We hope that states will refrain from taking action that fuel these factors. Secondly, we are struck by these groups' resourcefulness in financing and the use of new and emerging technologies. We understand that terrorism thrives on secrecy, on underground flows of money. We remain particularly alarmed because despite international pressure against it, Daesh continues to develop its ability to innovate in how it uses advanced technologies, decentralizing its operations and harnessing new forms of financing to ensure its own sustainability, including cryptocurrencies and other digital mechanisms. Panama is one of the few, or maybe even the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to be a member of the global coalition against Daesh, focusing our support exclusively on avoiding terrorist groups using the Panamanian banking system for their financing. For this reason, we value the reference to this coalition in the report, reflecting its joint communiqué dated October 2024, spearheaded by the United States. We call for continued national, regional, and interagency efforts working together to design tools to identify and confiscate assets intended for terrorism. Thirdly, we are concerned by the humanitarian crisis and the situation of repatriation and reintegration. We note with alarm the rise in violence and the fight against these armed groups, exacerbating a humanitarian crisis in Syria and establishing an environment conducive to the resurgence of terrorist groups. We urgently appeal to the international community to step up its efforts in protection, assistance, and specialized support for minors and women affected by terrorism. Only through a humanitarian approach and an approach based on the rights of the child will we be able to guarantee their protection and avoid them falling victim to a dual scourge, that of terrorism and being forgotten by the international community. We recognize, Mr. President, the efforts of several states in rehabilitation, repatriation, and the reintegration of children linked to terrorist groups, and we encourage the international community to follow this example. We believe that in the request made by the Secretary General to enable the safe repatriation, it's fundamental for these efforts to go hand in hand with effective programs to allow them to be reintegrated into their communities, removing them from the influence of extremist groups and providing opportunities for education, employment, and stability. Nonetheless, all of these efforts must be strengthened through continued support to the affected countries to bolster their security institutions, to promote economic development, and to address the root causes of radicalization. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement. And now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Mr. Voronkov as well as Madam German for their statements. Mr. President, terrorism continues to pose one of the gravest threats to international peace and security. Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates represent the most acute terrorist threat. These groups continue to reconfigure themselves and continue to expand their presence to numerous continents. In the Levant, Africa, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, they have demonstrated their ability to carry out cross-border attacks and to project attacks far from their bases. Daesh in particular has enhanced its foothold in the Sahel, the Gulf of Guinea, and the Horn of Africa. The growing strength of Daesh Khorasan, which is considered to be the most active branch of Daesh, is a major concern. Daesh remains a grave threat in Iraq, and especially in Syria. The organization has been seeking to exploit the transition underway to rebuild a safe haven in that country. We call upon the transitional Syrian authorities to continue counterterrorism efforts and to safeguard the gains that have been achieved over the course of years of counter-Daesh efforts. The terrorist group's MOs have evolved. They're misappropriating new technologies such as drones to carry out more targeted attacks and more lethal attacks. They continue to capitalize on the internet and exploit social networks to enhance the resonance of their attacks, to spread propaganda geared towards radicalizing audiences, and to incite terrorism as well as to attract new recruits. These groups thrive on the soil of where basic human rights are being violated, where women are marginalized, and where there's gender equality. Their use of sexual violence as a means of sowing terror has been documented. In light of these developments and changes of the threat, we have a responsibility to adopt a comprehensive global approach that is tailored to reflect realities on the ground. France has continued this commitment alongside its partners as part of the international coalition against Daesh. Strikes were carried out in December 2024 by the coalition, and this attests to our determination to counter Daesh. The efforts of the coalition need to continue along the military and civilian fronts. However, our concerted struggle against terrorism will only be effective if, in parallel, the root causes of radicalization which leads to violence are dealt with. Support for development, improvement and support for governance, rule of law, and the fight against corruption are critical factors in the security-related approach. The putative security offers proposed by certain private military companies are at odds with this comprehensive approach and only foment terrorism. The fight against terrorism needs to be part of a partnership incorporating regional and international organizations. We have an obligation to fully leverage multilateral instruments which have been established by the Security Council, including the 1267 committee, which is key in the international counterterrorism system. The Counterterrorism Executive Directorate plays a critical role in guiding states' implementation of these resolutions through its targeted recommendations and recommendations which are tailored to reflect national contexts. UNOCT, as well as the entities of the Global Coordination Pact, provide valuable technical assistance for building the capabilities of states affected by terrorism. The efforts of the International Counter-Daesh Coalition is fully aligns with international law, including the United Nations Charter, as well as the relevant resolutions of the Council. Our responses need to be tailored to reflect developments in the terrorist threat. The fight against terrorism financing, therefore, is a priority. There's a need together to fight against all modes of financing, including crypto assets and internet-based participatory financing means. And lastly, I would recall that counterterrorism can only be effective if there is full respect for human rights and rule of law. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the briefers, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov and Ms. Natalia Jaman, for their invaluable insights on the evolving threats posed by ISIL, Daesh, and its affiliates. At the outset, we express our sincere condolences to all member states who have suffered from recent terrorist attacks, resulting in unfortunate loss of lives and property. Terrorism in all its forms is a scourge that we must contain, degrade, and ultimately destroy if we are to build a safer and more peaceful world. We welcome the Secretary General's 20th Biennial Strategic Level Report on the threat posed by ISIL-Daesh to international peace and security. We acknowledge the critical work by the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact entities in addressing these threats and attacks, their impacts, and underlying conditions conducive to their entrenchment and spread. Globally, terrorism is the most significant threat to international peace and security today. Over the past years, the global terrorist threat has evolved and expanded in many countries and regions. ISIL, Daesh, and their affiliates continue to demonstrate resilience and adapt their modus operandi with extensive propaganda as well as increased finances, fighters, expertise, and technology. This despite the steady progress made by member states in targeting its leadership and financial operations. The situation in Syria is deeply troubling, with the possibility of ISIL exploiting the fragile security situation to strengthen their position and expand operations. There is also a risk that the stockpile of advanced weapons, including unmanned aircraft systems in the country, could be unsecured and fall into their hands, especially given that thousands of ISIL fighters still remain in prisons and refugee camps in northeastern Syria, including in Al-Hol camp, which accommodates about 39,000 ISIL members. ISIL-Daesh branches and affiliates, including Islamic State of West Africa Province, ISWAP, pose the greatest danger to stability and development in the West Africa and Sahel region, with violent attacks soaring by more than 250% in just 2 years. According to the African Union Counterterrorism Center, over 3,400 terrorist attacks resulting in almost 14,000 fatalities were recorded on the African continent in 2024 alone. These statistics tell a chilling story, and recent attacks in Nigeria, Mali, and Benin bring the horrifying reality into sharp focus. President, the impact of terrorist activity on women and girls is particularly devastating. Terrorists frequently exploit and brutalize women through sexual and gender-based violence, including forced marriages and abduction, causing profound trauma that reverberate through entire communities. Families are displaced, livelihoods are destroyed, and the social fabric necessary for resilience and recovery is torn apart. In this regard, we acknowledge the importance of Resolution 2734, which recognizes sexual and gender-based violence as a tactic of terrorism and allows for sanctions listings in the UN 1267 ISIL al-Qaeda regime. The international community must strengthen solidarity, intensify cooperation, and jointly tackle this increasingly complex and grim transnational threat. On this note, we wish to make the following points. First, addressing the root causes of terrorism as part of a key long-term and comprehensive approach to preventing further entrenchment and spread. A security-centered approach alone is insufficient to counter this threat. The necessity of comprehensive, multi-tiered, non-kinetic, and multi-stakeholder responses that focus on eradicating poverty, improving education, employment, the economy, and sustainable development cannot be overstated. We encourage Member States to incorporate the analysis and recommendations of the seated assessments in their prevention strategies. Second, people must be at the center of all efforts, especially those most affected by adversity, such as women, youth, and minorities. Human dignity must be respected in all circumstances. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned that women and girls are affected by sexual and gender-based violence committed by ISIL-Daesh. In this vein, particular emphasis should be put on integrating women, peace, and security considerations to address not only the immediate impacts of terrorism on women and girls, but also to empower women and girls as pivotal players in conflict prevention and peace building. Third, a global response is essential, as many global challenges, including terrorism, violent extremism, and climate change, are transnational. This collective responsibility must transcend political interests and external influence, must be leveraged positively and constructively. To this end, the international community should incorporate efforts by the entire UN system, global financial institutions, regional and sub-regional organizations, and civil society. Fourth, the UN sanctions regime, including 1267, continues to serve as an effective tool in the fight against terrorism and in maintaining and restoring international peace and security. We note the efforts of the Financial Action Task Force and call for enhanced UN coordination with the FATF to identify and remedy weaknesses in anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing frameworks. We also call on Member States to fully and robustly implement sanctions measures to counter and prevent the threat posed by terrorists. Finally, to eliminate this global threat effectively, we must take action at the national, regional, and international levels. Therefore, strengthening security and regulatory frameworks and accountability mechanisms for coordinated response at these levels is paramount. We acknowledge the efforts of the African Union in combating terrorism, including but not limited to the Malabo Declaration on Terrorism and on Constitutional Changes of Government, the establishment and operationalization of the AU Ministerial Committee on Counterterrorism, and the development of a comprehensive continental strategic plan on countering terrorism in Africa. We particularly welcome efforts to enhance regional cooperation and institutional building in the West Africa and Sahel region, including the high-level African counterterrorism meeting in Abuja in April 2024, which launched the Abuja process for mobilizing resources with support from UNOCT. Additionally, we underscore the need for adequate, sustainable, and predictable funding for counterterrorism efforts, particularly terrorism in Africa. And within that context, we call for the full and immediate implementation of UNSCR Resolution 2719 in financing EU-led peace support operations dedicated to combating terrorism or its effects on the continent. In conclusion, Mr. President, Sierra Leone emphasizes the importance of information sharing and collaboration among governments, institutions, private sector, and security actors across borders to successfully address the proliferation and destructive activities of terror groups. Collective resources will lead to better outcomes and are critical in rebuilding defenses against terrorism. In adopting the Pact for the Future, member states of the United Nations have committed themselves to building a world free of terrorism, online and offline. Let us not allow this unique opportunity that the Pact of the Future provides us pass us by. That is, to renew our commitment to multilateralism, strive for a future free from terrorism, and to build a more peaceful, prosperous, dignified, and secure world for all. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank Undersecretary General Voronko and Executive Director German for their briefings. Our thanks also go to the teams at UNOCT and STED and the monitoring team for the preparation of the reports under consideration. Mr. President, on the threat of Daesh, let me make the following 3 points. First, Slovenia reiterates its concern regarding the adaptability and resilience of Daesh and its affiliates. This is happening despite relatively successful counterterrorism operations and high levels of leadership attrition. The ever more decentralized operation structure means kinetic operations will have only limited impact on the overall threat. While these operations are essential for short-term security, new multi-layered approaches focusing on prevention will become even more essential. We therefore reiterate the need for comprehensive, inclusive, and gender-responsive approaches that address drivers of terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism, in accordance with international law, human rights, and the rule of law. These efforts need to include the whole of government and the whole of society approach, and keep abreast of trends in the functioning of terrorist networks. They need to be particularly focused on youth and their education, as young people are becoming the main target of radicalization. The role of women and women-led organizations is pivotal in prevention and de-radicalization activities and should be recognized. Digital tools that are often used to radicalize and recruit should be used for prevention on one hand and for offering alternatives such as education on the other. Second, we note the recent developments in Syria and the efforts by the interim authorities to stabilize the country and unify the security forces. Since taking the power, they showed significant success in limiting the influence of external actors.